Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the Apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the Apocalypse engine. I'm your MC Rich, and I'm joined by my guest, Paul Stefko of Nothing Ventured Games. Hey Paul, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Excited to have you on board. So let's kick it off with our normal question. How long have you been playing PBTA games, and what was your gateway?
Must have been 2013, early 2013, I think.
Okay.
With Dungeon World was my first exposure to it. There was this local monthly games day in Pittsburgh where I live, and some folks had a table and they're like, hey, we're going to try this Dungeon World out. And I'd very hazily heard that a game like that by that title existed. So I'm like, oh, I'll try that out. I think I played a barbarian and just went nuts with it, and it was awesome.
Nice.
So that was a cool introduction.
Nice. Yeah, my introduction to the Gauntlet was playing a barbarian as well. So it's a fun class. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's jump on over here and read a sitch.
Read a sitch.
In Read a Sitch, we have our guest talk about a specific issue of play, a journal of play, observing things happening at an ongoing PBTA game. Paul, I specifically wanted you to talk about something you have a bit of expertise in.
Mm-hmm.
So the game that we're here to talk about, the game that's overall focused that we'll talk about and open your brain, is Iron Edda, World of Metal and Bone.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about, where did this come about? Because it didn't start this way. Tell me about it.
So Tracy Barnett designed a Fate game called Iron Edda, War of Metal and Bone, which the pitch was originally developed as a stretch goal, I believe, for another Kickstarter project about Fate mecha game. I don't really remember the details of it too well, but Tracy ended up developing that on their own as a standalone project. And when they were getting their Kickstarter together, they asked folks on Twitter if anybody had ideas for stretch goals. And specifically, they wanted to see the world translated into other rules systems. I said, I've been discussing Dungeon World and Powered by the Apocalypse games with some folks in the game design community that I was a part of at the time. And I might want to discuss some ideas for translating it into PBTA. And within, a day or two, we had decided that I would be the first stretch goal for the Iron Edda Kickstarter. Long story short, it funded, we hit that stretch goal. So I wrote World of Metal and Bone as a PBTA adaptation of the Iron Edda world.
Right, that's perfect, and exactly why I've wanted to pick your brain, have you read a sitch here, because there are so many great settings out there in other RPG systems. I look at my shelf, right? I have a whole shelf of non-PBTA games, and I'm like, man, how do I run this in the kind of system that I feel most comfortable in? So, Paul, tell me a little bit about how did you look at Iron Edda in order to create a PBTA framework to be able to play in that setting?
It was actually really, I don't want to say that the process was easy, but the starting point was very easy because Tracy just said, I really only needed to have a couple of individual pieces of the setting. So the idea that there are giant steam-powered dwarven mecha. There are people that are bonded to the souls of giants and can raise the giants' bones out of the earth as bone mecha. And then the idea that your player characters are all part of a community called a holdfast. Like, those were the only things that I really had to have in place for my adaptation. And I think that's actually kind of a really good starting point for anyone adapting another setting to PBTA, is to identify the core nugget of what the world is. And in a lot of ways, world can mean the setting, but it also means the genre of narrative that takes place in that world. For Iron Edda, the idea is that it was basically a fantasy world that would be at home on the cover of a heavy metal album.
That's cool.
That was what I went off of when I was developing it, with those little nuggets of the setting in place. I didn't deviate too terribly much in the end from what Tracy had developed because the bones were just so rich to begin with. For someone who's looking to translate a setting into PBTA on their own, I would say the first thing that you should look at is what is the central narrative hook of that setting? So like, what is it that you want to come up every session?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a PBTA hack by designer Dave Chalker called Strange New Worlds, which is Star Trek, the PBTA game. He's never released it because obviously that's not a viable thing that you could publish on your own because it's
right
a little tied up in IP rights. But he said, what is the core of a Star Trek episode? And it's basically, there's a problem at the beginning. There's a question that needs to be answered, or there's a crisis that needs to be resolved. From there, it's just a matter of each character has their position on the ship, and how they go about dealing with that problem is based on the captain will give orders to the other people. The science officer will always be looking for a scientific explanation. The tactical officer will always be looking at it from a position of what's endangering the ship and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that encapsulation of the central narrative hook, the idea in the case of Strange New Worlds of a crisis to be solved, a mystery to be unraveled, or in the case of World of Metal and Bone, the world is in danger from invasion by the dwarves, and your holdfast is in particular at the center of that, like a ring of danger around it, and how you defend that holdfast. That's the core nugget for World of Metal and Bone.
When you took Iron Edda, did you even look at the mechanics of the Fate version of the game, or did you just take those?
No, actually I didn't.
Really?
Not at all. Because I was actually designing mine while Tracy was finishing the Fate version. So it was not ever a question of mechanically, how do I make it feel like the Fate version? Because they're not the same game. They are different games and they need to feel like different games. So really it was, how do I take the Powered by the Apocalypse mindset and engine and make a game that would take place in a similar world to the Fate version,
mm-hmm.
but they're not necessarily fitting into the same narrative hooks. So Fate is about dramatic, proactive characters, and it privileges the ability to always pull out a victory when you want it. Powered by the Apocalypse is not about that. Powered by the Apocalypse is, there is almost always a cost to whatever victory you pull out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the interesting parts happen. You're going along, you face an obstacle, you do what your character would do to overcome that obstacle, and what rolls out of that, that's where the interesting part comes in. Unlike Fate, where it's like you're doing what your character would do and you're drawing on the aspects that make your character a hero or a protagonist in the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And you take on the costs proactively in order to power your ability to be more awesome later. The two systems are almost mirror images of each other. In Fate, the cost almost always comes before the awesome. And in PBTA, it almost always comes as a result of the awesome.
Oh, that's a really interesting analogy. I dig that. That's cool. I try not to go too heavy into the design space and read a sitch, but that is really good for unlocking the way I will think about the Fate and PBTA in the future. One of the things I noticed about World of Metal and Bone is that you have for use with Dungeon World written on that. And when I look at it, I see some of the Dungeon World basic moves, but not all the Dungeon World basic moves.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of process would you suggest someone go into versus I'm going to build everything from scratch, or I'm going to pull from these games? Like, is it like, did you start off because Dungeon World was like the first PBTA game for you and it felt the most comfortable, or was it because Dungeon World's already a fantasy genre emulation engine?
It was primarily Dungeon World served as almost like a structural template for me.
Mm-hmm.
Everything in World of Metal and Bone, its original text and rules and everything, but structurally it very much follows how Dungeon World was put together, especially in how I looked at giving the GM advice, agendas and principles and such.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember back because it was a number of years ago that we were talking about actually doing the project, but I think the original idea was that it would be more of a expansion to Dungeon World.
Mm-hmm.
But as we got into the development of it, I felt that it would be simpler if I just reiterated, like, basically everything you need is in World of Metal and Bone instead of having it be an expansion or add-on to Dungeon World.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I see two moves that look familiar to Dungeon World: Defy Danger, Discern Realities. But there's and I guess Parlay maybe sort of, but yeah, there's a whole lot of new tech in here. That's interesting. So you started it with Dungeon World as an idea, but then as you, I guess, thought about the system.
Yeah, as I developed the idea and found the things that needed to be, I can't really say emulated because this is original IP,
Mm-hmm.
but the process would be the same if I were taking an existing game, what I would emulate about it. That was sort of, as I was developing World of Metal and Bone, I was looking at Dungeon World and going, okay, I need to deviate more than I was thinking originally. I need to iterate on this and expand, or in some places contract back from what Dungeon World was doing. So it became less of a hack and more of a derived work.
And I think that's a really good mindset for somebody that doesn't want to build a game from ground up, but just says, oh, I love the setting. What is a game in the PBTA space that does something like it, and then, pare back and build up in the right spaces? I think that's a really good cue for folks. I'm definitely going to keep that in my little notebook as I look across my shelf again.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, you got me pretty excited here. I would love it if we could maybe go ahead and open our brains up to World of Metal and Bone. What do you say, Paul?
Absolutely.
Open your brain.
Open your brain. This is where we talk about the game. We're actually going to talk about Iron Edda, World of Metal and Bone. Paul, tell me, what is the setting of Iron Edda, World of Metal and Bone? What's it about?
So Iron Edda, World of Metal and Bone is a epic fantasy game inspired by Norse mythology, set in an original fantasy world called Midgard that features an invasion by the dwarves of Norse mythology, who have constructed enormous metal destructive machines and are coming up from underground to lay waste to the world of man. It is Ragnarok. The gods are potentially on the verge of their own destruction, depending on perhaps what a group of heroic protagonist characters might say about it. But those characters are all members of a holdfast, a community in Midgard that has all sorts of its own troubles. But they are epic heroes, or in the course of their story will become epic heroes. And some of them may even have learned the ways of the bone bonded, which is to say that they have made a deal which have bound their soul to the spirit of a long dead giant. And they have gained the power to call upon that giant's wisdom and strength and power and literally raise the bones of the giant from the earth and ride it around to take on the Dwarven Destroyer robotic war machines on an even playing field.
Fantasy mecha.
Yep.
That is crazy. I love it. It's so high concept.
Pretty badass.
Okay. What mechanics in Iron Edda, World of Metal and Bone are different versus, say, in Apocalypse World?
The big mechanical thing that actually kind of helped me wrap my head around the whole mechanical structure of World of Metal and Bone was the idea of the wound statements.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of just having like a clock or a health track or hit points like Dungeon World has, your characters have a list of essentially quotes or narrative statements of how a wound that they take affects them. So let me just pull up one of the playbooks. So the Berserker, that's a good one. So a Berserker always has the following 3 wounds. My leg, I will drag myself over my foes. Or my arm is ruined, but I fight on. And finally, I hear the horns of Valhalla. That is their face death wound. But they also have a choice of 5 more from a big long list, which includes my favorite wound in the game probably, which is Roar! And the idea is that when you check off one of those wounds, that is what has happened to you as you are injured. You play on, assuming that that is now true in the fiction, because it is. But it's not like you're just ticking off hit points. It's not like you're checking off a wound clock or whatever. That is a strong narrative bit of information that really colors how the rest of the scene plays out.
Yeah, I agree. I love them because they're like visceral hit points. They're well written to be flexible enough for lots of different wound types. So that's pretty smart. I dig the wounds. Nice.
And the other thing that I'm particularly proud of are the 3 combat moves. So like the 3 physical conflict moves, which are drive them before you, deal death, and hold ground, which whenever you would get into a physical conflict with another individual or group of individuals, it basically all comes down to how good of a match are they for you. If they're just mooks that don't stand a chance against you, you just drive them before you, which says, when you exhibit your prowess against a force of unworthy opponents, you eliminate any number of them, and the GM makes a move against you. So it's literally, there's 100 levy soldiers with cheap wooden spears between me and the city I need to get into. I drive them before me. I just slay 100 men in one move. And then the GM says, okay, that's cool. Also, your shield breaks because one of them got a lucky hit on you.
That's cool.
If you're up against someone who's your equal, then you deal death. And that is where you're actually trading wounds with each other in a more typical back and forth hack and slash kind of way. If you're going up against something that you legitimately have no real chance against, but damn everything, you're going to give your life if you have to stop its advance, that's when you hold ground. And it says, when you stand firm against an overwhelming enemy, roll plus heart, which is one of the stats. And then there's a list of things which include the enemy is slowed, buying time. The enemy is weakened in a real way. You reveal a significant opening that can be exploited against the enemy. You save something precious that is at risk. After the roll, regardless of the result, you face death.
Wow.
Which basically means your single protagonist standing there with sword and shield can face down a dwarven destroyer and buy everyone else time, or hurt it in a real way, even though you've just got a sword. But then there's a darn good chance that the Valkyries are going to be carrying you off to Valhalla.
That's awesome. Talk to me a little bit about the Val system and how that works, Paul.
Yeah, so in World of Metal and Bone, your character begins play with a vow, which is something that you have sworn before the gods, some great task that you will perform. At the end of each session, if you've worked toward fulfilling that vow, you get to mark experience. It is also possible through other moves in play to take on additional vows.
Mm-hmm.
For example, when you face death, there is the chance that the gods will offer you the opportunity to return to the world of the living, but you have to swear a new vow to them, which is in addition to the current one, or it can completely replace the current one. That's your choice. And if you take on more than one vow at the same time, you have to have worked toward all of them in order to mark experience at the end of the session. So if you end up with multiple vows and they're contradictory, you have to decide which of these am I advancing today? Which of these am I actually working toward? And that can create some very interesting dilemmas for your character in play.
Tell me, Paul, what is your favorite move?
Oh.
And why?
This one may seem a little innocuous at first, but it plays into what I said earlier about some of the tech that I'm most proud of in the game. So the Seithkona, which is the wise woman, the sorceress, the magical crafter playbook. They have a move called Weave Protections. And you literally weave a protective garment for another character. And then on a 7 to 9, you get to choose one of these. On a 10+, you get to choose both. But they get additional wound statements. And they are, missed me by that much. and the other one is, torn cloth, not flesh.
That's cool.
So you're literally giving another player, you're giving them bonus hit points, but it's those narrative, descriptive wound statements that I really love. And you do it by literally making a shirt of armor or a cloak or something and giving it to them. You've woven your magic into it and it makes them hardier. And I just, like I said, it might seem innocuous to somebody reading through because there's all sorts of ridiculous badass moves and other things. And we haven't even talked about the bone bonded mechanics and stuff, but that one I think is my personal favorite.
Well, you got me pretty excited here about this. I would love it if we could take an opportunity to act under fire for a wee bit. What do you think?
Absolutely.
It is time to act under fire.
All right, in Act Under Fire, our guest runs a bit of their game, and I get to play it.
The iconic playbook, I think, is the Berserker. So you're a Berserker. You are a fearsome warrior that calls on the strength of your rage in battle to enter a state called the Berserker Gong. You have set out from your holdfast to scout out a report of a enormous monstrosity that has been stalking through a secluded valley in the mountains above your holdfast. As we open, you're standing at the mouth of this valley. It is a heavily forested, deeply sloped-sided valley. And as you're standing there, the air is very still and cold. Winter is right around the corner. The thing that you notice most of all is that the sound of wildlife is gone. What do you do?
Plussy, the Berserker, realizing the lack of sound of the animals, is concerned, not worried. There is obviously a threat here, something dangerous. I'd like to study this place for a few moments before I move further into the valley.
Okay, so you take a moment, channel your senses, try to discern the nature of your reality. So you would roll plus I. So if you have +1 and everything, just get +1.
That is a 9.
Okay.
So I can ask one question.
Yeah.
What should I be on the lookout for?
As you peer out up the slopes across the forested scene, you can see about halfway up the valley, the pine trees moving as if something very large and heavy were passing between them without care toward disturbing them at all. And in fact, large enough that its mere passage between them will shift entire trees.
I will heft my axe and move closer. I need to know what this is. What threat does it pose to my holdfast?
So you progress into the woods. Before long, you begin to smell smoke, but not wood smoke like you're very familiar with. It's some more acrid, burning stench. And mixed with it is some kind of oily smell it smells greasy and acrid, and as if something had climbed up from the underworld. Nothing made by mortal hands should smell like this.
Mm.
And then you hear the clanking, grinding of metal on metal from up ahead of something huge moving. And it's moving towards you. It's not moving quickly towards you, but it is definitely coming in your direction.
With the knowledge that something is coming my way, that I am all that may stand between it and the holdfast, I call upon Magni and Thor to watch over me as I move forward. We'll face this thing. We'll learn how to defeat it.
Now let me ask you, is Plussy one of the bone bonded?
Well, if I said no, we wouldn't see a super awesome thing happen, so I think yes, he is one of the bone bonded. Perhaps he should call upon the giant.
That is entirely up to you. You can feel the soul of the giant bonded to your own stirring as if it's longing to answer a horn that you can't quite hear yet, but it can.
Yes, I will call upon Arvindil the Dawnstar, the giant that lost one of its toes to Thor. Thor threw it into the sky, and it now shines as the brightest star in the early morning. I will call upon that bond that I have with it in order to defeat this unworthy foe.
So what does it look like as you draw the bones of the giant from the earth and they lift you into the sky?
There's a low rumble of thunder as I hope, or I believe in my mind, Thor smiles upon me as these bones roll out of the earth and build into this giant skeleton, pulling me up into its rib cage, surrounding me with this bluish nimbus of spirit and essence. The axe that I held in my mortal form is replicated in a large redwood that is capped with the blade of many, many oars of iron.
As you rise up, you're held within the chest cavity of the giant, wreathed in a cool flame around you. And you rise up and you can see now above the tops of the trees as a bit of a ways in that direction that you smelled that smoke and heard the grinding sound, another figure stands up out of the forest, and it looks like a crude mockery of the giant's bones that you ride, that is made of plates of steel and straps of some kind of infernal mammoth leather holding it all together. There's a pipe sticking out of its back that is just belching a cloud of noxious smoke. You can hear now the horn of battle calling you toward this thing, with the ears of your bonded giant lending you their acuity. And you know that this metal monstrosity before you means the death of all of your kin in your holdfast unless you stop it. It hefts an entire pine tree as an enormous club and holds it over its head as it stares at you.
Charge forward, wielding the axe, and I want to wield my power against a worthy foe.
Yeah. So go ahead and roll plus your arm stat. So you've got a +1 in all your stats, but this uses arm.
Okay.
To deal death.
Ooh, 4 + 2 + 1 is a 7.
Okay. I'll just say that you're using a great axe.
Mm-hmm.
You swing it with great force and it collides with the metal protecting this, whatever this construction is. And there's a clang and it reels a bit, but you're not sure if that blow is strong enough to do any lasting harm to it. As it rights itself, it brings that tree around and swings it at, well, not your head, but the head of the skeleton that you reside within. And it bashes into you and the tree splinters around you and you're sent reeling a bit, You have enough protection from your own armor and from the bones of the giant that you also do not take a wound. But you now realize that facing this thing, even in the bones of your giant, you're on equal terms with it, but the two of you may be better protected, and you may need to call on even deeper reserves of your own fury and rage to handle this thing. Would you call on that rage to defeat this unearthly foe?
I think I need to enter the Berserker state, right?
Yeah,
I think
so
that is what I'll do.
You're gonna roll.
Yeah.
You're gonna roll plus arm again.
Ooh. Okay, let's see how it goes. Got an 8.
Okay, so you have entered the Berserker Gong, and you have hold 1. And since you are bone bonded with the Berserker playbook, you now have an additional point of protection. So you're even more protected against its blows. You can spend the hold for your Berserker Gong for one of these effects. You inflict an additional wound that ignores all of its protection, or you ignore all wounds that would be inflicted on you by a single attack. Or you can overcome the limitations of mortal strength or endure some otherwise unbearable hardship. So you have one hold for that.
Okay.
And once you've spent it, you leave the Berserker state and take a wound. But while you have it, let's see what you can do with it.
Well, now that I've entered the state, I think the most obvious thing is to strike at this thing again.
Yeah.
See if I can deal death. Ooh, I rolled a 9 that time. Plus 1 makes it a 10.
Oh, that means that you strike true, and this time you strike with the killer instinct of the Berserker Fury and drive your axe into what would on a man be the shoulder blade. But apparently the metal plating just where the head, top turret, whatever this thing has in place of a head, between that and the shoulder is weaker than the rest of it. And you drive your weapon into that area, and as you pull it out, you see that you've cleaved a large rent in the metal. And from inside, you see fire and you see sparks, but you also see bearded faces, craggy, leathery skin under slate gray beards of dwarves inside this monstrosity, operating it, haunting it. You're not really sure what's going on, but you have dealt a blow to this thing, and it reels back away from you.
I'll spin that hold with that blow if I can.
Sure, to do additional damage to it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you twist your axe with all of your fury as you rip it out. An entire plate flies off of the shoulder of this thing, and a gout of flame comes out of it. And you see a few of these dwarves tumble out of the hole. At which point you start to hear shouting from inside in an unknown tongue, whatever language dwarves speak. And the giant metal construct actually takes a full step back from you, knocking entire trees over behind it, and then pauses for a moment as if considering you and considering what you've done to it. And then it turns and it starts striding with much greater than speed than it was using before, back up the valley and into the cleft of the mountains. It seems to be fleeing from you. Perhaps this was a scout, much like you are.
Then I think that the last thing we see is Plessy the Berserker giving chase. I take a wound when I come out of the Berserker Gong,
yes.
But still I'm going to struggle on. I can't let this thing get back to his compatriots.
Just so we know what that looks like, because you're the Berserker. Oh, let's just go with it. You check off your Rarg wound
Yes.
as you give chase. Losing all sense of tactical advantage as you pursue the construct up into the mountains. And I think we can call the scene there for now. We might cut back to what the other PCs were doing back at the Holdfast, perhaps, if this were a real game.
Oh my goodness, that was so cool. Paul, thank you so much for coming on Plus One Forward and telling me all about Iron Edda, World of Metal and Bone. For folks who might be interested in following you on social media, websites, anything like that, where can they find you?
Oh yeah, I'm easy to find. I'm on Twitter at Paul Stefko, and my website is nothingventuredgames.com. It's a little out of date right now. I need to spruce it up a little bit, but please feel free to check that out. It has links to my personal publications as well as my freelance work with other companies.
Awesome.
I just want to thank you so much for having me on. This was really great.
Thanks again, Paul. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Plus One Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at +1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and Magay Baker. The music for Plus One Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, Metal Version, and Drowning Attitude. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.
Hi listeners, Jason from Gauntlet Publishing here. I want to tell you about a couple of new things we have for you this month. The first is Nephews in Peril, a major expansion for Brindlewood Bay, the game of cozy murder mysteries and supernatural horror. Nephews in Peril is a collection of 6 new mysteries for the game, each by a different fabulous author, and some revised rules and gameplay advice. It can be found in the $6 plus Gauntlet Patreon feed until October 15th, and then Drive-Thru RPG after that. The next thing I want to tell you about is Codex Home, the first issue in Volume 5 of the magazine. Codex Home features new material for Trophy Gold and Brindlewood Bay, plus the all-new game Back Again from the Broken Land, which is about fantasy heroes recounting stories as they return home from a calamitous war against a Dark Lord, all while evading the remnants of that Dark Lord's army. It's a fantastic Powered by the Apocalypse game, and we're delighted to share it with you later in October. Remember, your contributions to the Gauntlet Patreon help support everything we do in the community, including this very podcast. As always, thanks so much for your support.